if I can just grab your attention, we're going to make a start for the next session now. I apologise if my voice is a bit croaky. I've got a bit of a cold or man flu or whatever sympathy you want to give me. So I'll try and keep going. So this next section, we're going to zoom in now. So we've heard about the international perspectives, and we're now going to zoom in and look at Plymouth and understand what's going on in Plymouth. Sorry if I grab you everyone's attention, yeah. Yeah, I think so. Sorry, I think it's just my voice. Sorry. We're going to zoom in, as I said, now I think about the Plymouth perspectives and talk to some key partners and some key organisations that are operating and working in Plymouth, although we will be zooming out because everyone's in person as opposed to being behind the screen on Zoom. So we've got Matt Bell, who's the CEO of the Octopus Project, Hannah Harris, who's the Chief Executive of the Plymouth Culture, and finally Elaine Hayes, who's the Chief Executive of Plymouth Sound Marine National Park. Before I get it. So I'll hand over to Matt and let you speak for the next 10 minutes. Okay.
Great. Thanks, John. Okay, I've got to try and not have a coughing fit because I've just recovered from a horrible virus. So thanks for inviting me. Bob and Patrick, huge, very exciting to speak at something like this. So I'm Matt. I run a charity called Plymouth Octopus. We have actually dropped the project because we're trying to be a bit more than a project. And we look after grassroots and community organisations across the city. So here is my tuppence worth for today. Okay. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I've ran through this and I'm always over time. But basically to say, qualified as a design engineer, I went to do a Master's of Sustainable Development. And so what comes next is an amalgamation and insights from 20 years experience trying to do stuff around social innovation and social change. Okay. Now I'd like to, I thought I was bringing a different perspective, but it doesn't feel like different having heard previous speakers. So I think we can point to all the kind of many crises that we face, whether it's pandemics, whether it's climate change, whether it's mental health issues, whatever it might be. I don't think that's our challenge. I think our challenge is in how we see the problem. How we approach the challenges that we face are directly informed and directed by our individual paradigms or the way that we see and understand the world. Okay. So what difference does it make if we change the way that we see the problems, or we see them in a new light? And one of the ways that we are trying to do this is social isolation in Plymouth. We're trying to visualize it in a different way to the usual. So on the left, you've got your stats, you've got a list of things that contribute to social isolation. And on the right, you've got a map of all the various factors that we've taken out of conversations that we're having around belonging in Plymouth. And what I think this does is it just helps visualize the complexity of the issue that we're trying to tackle. Because if we see a problem as predictable and controllable, the expectations of solutions look more machine-like, whereas complex problems demand far greater focus on learning, feedback, and adaptability. And we stop seeing problems in isolation and we start to see them as part of an interconnected whole. The other thing that I think, if we start to see problems as complex, it ceases to make sense that they belong to one particular institution or organization, and they become collaborative and shared problems for us all to try and solve. And solutions become multiple and stop becoming singular. Because just taking an example of mental health, it's kind of crazy that the idea that we might have a single mental health service to solve the mental health crisis, that doesn't feel like a sensible way to see a solution. And And the idea that any one service or provision or intervention can provide a solution becomes redundant. And we need to see that there's a response on all different levels and a collaboration and connection between all of them. And I think the way that we currently see our problems manifest in the huge relevance gap between the current policy and where we're actually facing. So I quite liked Tony's talk. I quite liked the fact that it was pretty abrupt and realistic, I think, in the shift, because he's not observing what could be. He's observing in the here and now. People in the world are moving because of climate in the here and now. So I think we need to face up to the reality of what we're looking at, and the current policy situation and structure doesn't meet the challenges. Okay, so a quick bit about Plymouth. So we've been doing some work as a team to think about, well, where do we sit in all of this? What's the narrative behind our work? And part of the conversation that we've been having is, well, what do we want to draw out of Plymouth? And we feel that Plymouth is at the edge. It's the edge of the UK, so we're stuck off in a peninsula somewhere. We're on the edge of the moors, and we're on the edge of the sea, and we're on the edge of the land. And sometimes we're on the edge of power. So looking at the kind of rebuilding after the war, we were kind of slightly forgotten as a city. And we have edges within the city between groups of people. So we're a military city, we're a university city, we're a working class city. We have a huge kind of grassroots cultural and art scene as well. And historically, we've been seen as a kind of valued friend. We've been the royalists, but we've also been parliamentarians, as seen during the siege of Plymouth. And I think we're also a city where we've got many different neighbourhoods. Again, thinking about the edges between and the spaces between is something that comes forward from our thinking about Plymouth as a city. And so what the opportunity, I think, it gives us is to be able to hold the tensions that we have in the city now and from in the past, and it gives us an opportunity to explore those edges. So this is where I think we've got an opportunity, is to develop a new civic infrastructure or infrastructures and technology, and rewrite the rules behind which we make decisions, how we govern, and the ways in which we organise. So our places, our spaces, the policies that we use, and the methods of organising our work all could shift if we shift our mindset. So do we see the world as separate, competitive, predictable, independent, or do we see the world as connected, collaborative, unpredictable, interdependent, organic, and complex? Because what that does is it shifts the ways and the structures we use to organize our work. So on one hand, I quite like this. I'm not making any judgment on the hierarchy, because actually I don't think it is an or. It's a both and an and. So we absolutely don't want to get rid of the tools and techniques and the technologies that have been built with this mindset, but we absolutely do want to build the tools and technologies that allow us to work in this different way. I'm going to give a quick quote from Frederic Laloux, who wrote a book, Reinventing Organizations. So it turns out that throughout history, the types of organizations we've invented were tied to the prevailing worldview and consciousness. Every time that we, as a species, have changed the way we think about the world, we have come up with more powerful types of organizations. So, what can we come up with in Plymouth? So a new civic infrastructure and technology, I think it makes better use of networks. It doesn't just see organizations as ways of organizing our work. Networks, relationships, looser forms of organizing, movements, can equally, if not more, be more impactful and effective. We're able to manage mass participation. So we're able to manage the ability to have citywide collective conversations about the issues that really matter. We start to create spaces for collective sense-making so that we can take the conversations that we're having in this room out of the hands of policymakers and policy wonks and academics and take those conversations to where it really, really matters, which is into communities. We can start to develop tools to create many-to-many relationships, not the usual bilateral relationships that we are used to at the moment. Collaboration becomes much better understood and becomes a conscious practice and not just a rhetoric. And the investment flows are based on our ecological ceiling and social foundations, and are able to flow through the structures that allow the work to happen, not because of a particular role or a particular position that someone has. And more land and property become held in collective and community ownership. But this gives us another kind of tension, because the scale of the challenge is huge, but our ability, our individual ability to affect change is really small. We can affect change at an individual level. So what micro changes can we all make that would result in the macro transformation? And just quickly, the reason that POP is interested in this is because, one, we want to take our own responsibility in facing up to some of these challenges, but also grassroots and community voices cannot be heard because, generally speaking, community is operating on the right-hand side. It's complex and messy and nobody really rules the roost. And they're trying to talk into systems that are built on the left-hand side, which is about control, predictability, and so on. So where could we start as individuals? And I think what we need to start to think about is trust and how we build trust between our friends, our family, and the people that we work with. So there's quite a nice trust equation. So credibility plus reliability plus authenticity build trust, and it is negated by self-orientation. So I think we need to think about how do we consciously build relationships and trust. When you meet, how well are you hearing different voices? How many times are you inviting in difference and challenge? When challenge is heard, what do you do with that challenge? Do you exclude it? Or are you curious and lean into it? How do you understand who is impacted by decisions and how have they been involved in that decision making? Who has influence over your work life? And what does that influence look and feel like? Because I think if we can unlock at this tiny micro level our capacities to connect as individuals, we will start to see that cascade outwards from teams into organizations and into the work that we're wanting to happen. So final slide, hopefully I'm not doing too badly. So we've got examples in the city of this great stuff starting to happen. So we've got Nudge. I'm really pleased that Hannah's here. Because Nudge aren't just thinking about collective ownership of land and property. They are highly collaborative in the work that they do as well. So they are always looking out into the community to bring people in. We've got the Plymouth Alliance, which has built an alliance contract which fundamentally shares risk between the commissioner and the provider. We've got Plymouth Energy Community, which is holding community energy assets in collective ownership. And we've got the work of POP thinking about the development of networks as an organizing structure and collaboration across the city. So as we start to kind of develop this work, I think it can only start to cascade and get faster. But to start, we need to slow down to start thinking about the relationships and individual relationships that we hold in order that we can then start to speed up. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for a really interesting and thought-provoking question. Sorry, can you hear me? Sorry. Yes, and that was perfect timing. So hand over to Hannah Harris from CEO of Plymouth Culture, and we can take questions then at the end.
Thank you. And I'm really pleased to be having this last slot, actually, because I think there's so many threads of discussions that have come through today that hopefully I'm going to pick up on a little bit today. So just to introduce myself and our organisation, I'm Hannah Harris. I'm the Chief Exec of Plymouth Culture. We're a sector development agency here in the city, focusing specifically on creative and cultural industries. We're a charity, so an independent organisation, but we receive core funding from the Arts Council and the City Council as a strategic partner. So we work directly with artists and cultural organisations, right through to our local government partners. So what I'm going to talk today really about is about cultural identity, because I think that's really sits at the very centre of a lot of the conversations we've had today, and hopefully that will continue this afternoon. Thank you. So in 2020, shortly after I came into post, we were asked by the local authority, we were mandated to rewrite the 10-year culture plan for the city. You may have noticed we went into a pandemic at that time, and I think our strategy is all the better for it, because it was a moment in which the world had completely stopped, had turned on its head, and we could see exactly what was always wrong with what we were doing and how we were operating. And it was a moment at which we said, rather than churning out the same old strategy that we might have done, why don't we actually ask ourselves some really serious questions about what was wrong with yesterday and why we don't want to build back to what we had? And actually, how might we use a cultural strategy to do things differently and to effectively change systemic issues? And so we started to look at a culture strategy in a very different way. We developed key drivers that were much more around an inclusive, sustainable, resilient economy. And we placed culture and creativity at the centre of making that possible, a mechanism through which those things can be achieved. So you'll see these are extracts from the culture plan. I encourage you to read it, that start to look at community, they start to look at nature, they start to look at our locality as important features of our cultural identity that actually are able to drive future change. And then next slide, please. Within our ambitions, there's a couple in particular that really do start to bring this concept of blue, grey, green landscapes into the fore, and how it's not just about us painting pretty landscapes and artistic outputs, but actually our proximity, our geography are what build our cultural identity. They're embedded in our DNA. They are what drive our industry. They are what create the pioneers, the risk takers that you see in localities like Plymouth, building new and different for the future. And so that was a part of what we really wanted to, no, that's fine. That's part of what we really wanted to focus on, how we bring these things into play. So we place art and cultural activity into these spaces, but also those landscapes drive our cultural activity. And so we focused on three main areas, our spaces. So actually those spaces, places, geographies that make Plymouth really unique and offer us an opportunity to really connect with the ocean, but also that kind of climate agenda. We talk about the sector, so the real role of creatives and creators in driving this forward, and not to forget this doesn't happen without them. There must be a thriving cultural sector here to make any of this possible. And so we have to build some resilience and some kind of economic prosperity in that space. And then the people, so not to, as can happen, kind of position art and culture in an elite space, actually to understand it as a very core human driver for expression, engagement, empowerment. And so how do we ensure that their cultural activity, we're democratising culture, we're bringing people's voices into the fore, and we're using art and creativity as a mechanism for engagement. We saw that so fundamentally in COVID, where people turned to baking and drawing and music and singing and so on and so on and so on as a very core foundation of living and being and surviving. And then now we're back to normal and everyone forgot that they painted rainbows and baked banana bread. And actually we should remember that that is what created survival and resilience in many people and communities. Thank you. And so within each one of those, the strategy goes into more detail, but you'll start to see hopefully some threads of what's been discussed today where we talk about our landscapes being our canvas and our stage. They are not separate to who we are or how we express or how they inform our expression. We talk about the people. Artists and creatives are creative thinkers, and that is the core. This isn't about more artists and portraits and people on stage. It's about creative thinking. It's about having the ability to imagine a better world. If you cannot imagine a better world, you cannot create it. It's as simple as that. So having that creative thinking, that ability to think beyond, to think differently is so fundamental to our future and these real challenging societal issues. And then our communities, and Matt's framed that beautifully, around how you build that grassroots empowerment, that kind of movement where actually every small step does count and does matter, and that mass participation moves to global change. And so one of the examples, I guess, I just wanted to focus on, and this might seem a little detached from arts and culture, but I'll circle back around to show you how it is connected. Fab City, so when I was working at the Arts University some years ago before this role, we have a Fab Lab and we started to look at the role of Fab Labs, particularly in cities like Barcelona, where it was about giving resources, technology, high-end technology to the community to play with, to break, to fail fast, to move on, to prototype. And that actually by doing so, you create problems you create solutions to problems at a localized level that can then be shared globally. And so the Fab City movement came out of that kind of Fab City Fab Lab network and is basically a commitment of cities, now over 60 of them across the world, that by 2054, we will produce all almost that we consume. So we've heard today about the kind of growth of cities, the high density of cities, that's only going to get worse. And that actually there is a need to think about how the city itself becomes a more circular economy. And so it works on a fundamental basis that over time through the Industrial Revolution, we have exported and transported materials and product. And instead what we should do is transport data and ideas and keep the production local. And so you can look at that in terms of food or clothing or regeneration of housing and retrofitting. So much like the Adelaide example of the green parks, Fab City is a concept. It has a manifesto, but each locality decides what its real driving force is and how it's going to interpret that and contribute to a more locally productive circular economy. Thank you. So they have a manifesto. And again, thematics that have come up today is this more holistic approach. So you don't just look at education and then housing and then community, but actually it's considered in the round, and that there is a manifesto that is central, and then you develop your own outcomes out of this. And so every city has taken this slightly differently, and we're now also seeing fab regions developing, which I think is really key to the discussion today, where yes, there's a city at the core of it, but actually how does it interface with the hinterland? Or how does it have kind of commonality with other areas outside of the immediate city boundary? And so there's at least 20 now fab regions that are emerging across the globe that are starting to think about themselves in a slightly different way. Thank you. What has also been discussed today is it isn't an either or. So Fab City is a concept. It's about creating a movement, very much grassroots. You can all take an action, you can all do something. But it does not work unless you have the policy drivers, the political leaders operating as well. So they have this described as a full stack model, that this is about operating for change at every level, and that it isn't an either or. So Fab Labs are about local, grassroots energy, information, prototyping, and then Fab City is about political leverage and change. It's built off of white papers and policy change. And it's not about either or. You have to do it all. And so it's a really interesting model. Plymouth became the first UK Fab City in 2019. We are still the only UK Fab City. And I think that means something. It means something because it means we believe we are already a Fab City. This is not a new idea and a brand and identity. It's about what's already happening here in the city. It's about saying that we see these pockets of community activity and local authority activity and private sector developments that are actually already operating in this way. But what does it mean when you bring those together? What might the change be possible if we had this across everything we do? And fundamentally, the reason I'm still involved in this is creativity sits at the core of that. And that's for three reasons, I think. As I've mentioned, our artists and our creatives can think creatively, and they should be sitting around planning table, the education table. They shouldn't just be siloed to the creative and cultural sector. They have something to contribute to every city agenda. And it's really important that our creative minds are around those tables. I think secondly, creativity is a mechanism through which we can engage people. You saw in Adelaide's example of those 160 projects, I would guess at least half of them were arts and culture based, whether it's drawing or writing or singing or performing. And then I think thirdly, because as in the example of Big, you bring about change by firstly locating cultural activity and creating identity. You put food in a place, you put music in a place, you put theatre in a place. All of a sudden, people want to live there. It's not the other way round. And I think all too often we plan processes, systems, structures without the heart at them, without a cultural identity, and it's the wrong way round. And so this, those three levels about people, sector and place are really critical for change like this to happen, because they are about giving people, the Fab City is about giving people this framework within which that creativity can flow and that connectivity can happen for place. So I leave you with two provocations. The first, and I realise there is a spelling mistake in this, I'm so sorry, I don't have time to change it. Our cultural identity is shaped by our relationship with and proximity to the ocean. So empowering our creative community to make that visible and tangible is a step towards a better global future. Secondly, we have a unique opportunity to embrace the concept of Fab City within our unique coastal city and creating a model for resilience like no other. I think a Fab City that is a coastal city is an utterly unique proposition, and there's something very powerful we could do with that. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. That was really fantastic. And I think it was really nicely how you pulled all that together, all the things we've heard already this morning came together in your presentation, and that importance of the creatives and that methodological approach that needs to be pulled to these problems. Too often it's an afterthought after you hear interdisciplinary projects and someone say, yes, we've got an artist, they're going to take a picture of some test tubes. That's the wrong approach. It really does need to be that methodology that the artist brings being at the key of those solutions to those problems. So I'll now hand over to Elaine Hayes, from the Plymouth Sound Marine National Park.
Hello. Well, the privilege of being last up is you get very scared. Totally blown away by the quality and content today. I'm just going to try and talk to you a little bit about what we're trying to do with the National Marine Park. I'm a doer as well as a bit of a thinker, but I think I'm more of a doer than a thinker. So what I'm going to try and do is to share with you our journey so far, but put it in the context of some of what we've heard this morning. I'm going to make an effort at that. Next slide, please. So many of you will have seen this slide before if you've heard me talk about the National Marine Park previously. I think the first thing to talk about is the fact that actually it's a declaration. So when we start talking about grassroots and movement for change, what better way to do that than to say, actually, yep, that's us. We'll put our hand up and we'll be bold enough and brave enough to recognise that in order to affect change, you actually have to be one of those people. The very neat thing as well, and the not so neat thing, which I'll talk about later, is there are no rules. So we're making our own. So that's kind of fun because I can dare to say things that are incredibly subversive, provocative, sometimes wrong. But it's okay because we've got permission to play. I was appointed in 2022, but my relationship with the idea of National Marine Park goes back many years. I've been in and around the marine sector for many years. I can remember sitting in a room, not unlike this, a very large number of people going, oh, National Marine Park, that's a great idea. And I wanted to make a huge one. I wanted to make it for the whole of the southwest coast. Oh, I'm so glad we didn't. Because believe me, just doing what we're doing currently is enough. We're very lucky that we've secured a significant amount of funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, but it comes with a lot of strings attached. I'm not going to go into the detail of the Horizons project today, not least because that would use about 10 hours, not 10 minutes. But one of the big things that I'm involved in is actually delivering this roadmap. So when I talk about the roadmap, it's really interesting because there isn't one. So I always talk about, the great thing about Google Maps for people like me who have no sense of direction is that when I want to get from A to B, Google actually tell me how to do it. And actually when I get it wrong, they even go, that's wrong. Go this way, not that way. That's a real joy of technology. With the National Marine Park, it takes a lot longer than you expect because I seem to find the cul-de-sacs, and I'm really good at doing that. But for every cul-de-sac that I find, there's a learning, and for every learning, I can share that, and I can take others who are on this journey with me. And we're at the moment developing a 5-year delivery plan as well. Next slide, please. Why would we bother? So there's a really good question. We're an island nation that's turned its back on the sea. We've had national parks on the land for 75 years, and I can talk to you a lot about the kinder trespass and people wanting to be able to have access to land and so on. But strangely, they didn't want access to the sea. Now, why would that be? Well, I can give you some reasoned answers around nobody understood it. Nobody really gets it. It's kind of salty. It's kind of wet. This time of year, it's very cold. As somebody who swims all year round, it's very cold at the moment. So it wasn't something that was in people's psyche. But actually, my argument is that having taken so long to think about national marine parks, we're actually in a unique position because we can actually leapfrog a lot of what's happened with national parks and make something that is even bigger and better. Next slide. Okay, so this is my one biology natural history rant for the day. This is my background. Marine biodiversity in the world is not around the coast of the UK. That's what that map says. So if I do one thing by setting up Plymouth Sound National Marine Park, I start to address that challenge. It is to my shame that biodiversity in the world has got worse during my lifetime. And if I can do one thing that starts to address that, then that's something that's important to me. Next slide. I was really interested in we got stuck slightly. Don't worry. I was really interested in what Sharon had to say about national city parks because I was reading some of the stuff that was on its slides that she didn't actually talk about. And one of the things she said was around having to explain what a national city park is. Oh, that is my world. We often talk about national marine parks as, it's a national park in the sea. But actually, we want it to be so much more than that. My argument around national parks is that they were, and to a large extent, remain for a privileged few with access, with income, with knowledge and understanding, whereas national marine parks should not be that. And if anything that will prove that, it will be our work with the Horizons project, where actually fundamentally at our core is working to understand how we engage those who don't get engaged in these kind of discussions, how we can meet people where they're at. And it's a very different way of working because it means that people like me have to make ourselves very vulnerable and we have to ask those hard questions. We also have to be prepared to be wrong. And I think the first 2 years of our development phase of Horizons has taught us a lot about not knowing what we should know and how we're going to do things differently in the future. So that is the vision for the National Marine Park for Plymouth. Is it perfect? No. Do I think it does what it says? I think so. But I'm always up for changing things and shape-shifting things because, we're not perfect. Next slide, please. So, what do we want to do? Get us back to the sea. Get us back to what really matters. Everything comes from and flows to the sea. I'm going to show a slide in a minute which actually really speaks to the heart of it. But fundamentally, affecting change is about people And a lot of the talks today have been about people and how people can change things. And as a conservationist, this is a share. I applied for a job with a very well-known local charity, and I was up against a guy who was talking about nature. And we were down to the last two, and I wanted this job. Oh boy, I wanted this job in here. And I presented an argument that the way that we resolved nature challenges was by, with, and through people. I didn't get the job. Maybe that's the right answer, and maybe that was the right outcome because it was the wrong time and place. National marine parks have to be delivered by, with, and through people, because I can continue to restore nature, but if I don't engage every single person about why we need to make that change, then we will not be able to make progress in the way that we need to. And again, Sharon's presentation, one of her challenges was around reaching everyone, everywhere, all of the time. Oh, that's my world. Next slide, please. Thank you. So there's a gentleman at the back talking about parish councils and other councils, and I think that's very relevant. So I've just wanted to show you why it matters. Our seas take everything that comes out of the rivers. So the rivers are our blue arteries. And everyone, if you shut your eyes, can think about where your nearest river, stream, ginnel, canal, whatever you want to call it is. And they're absolutely vitally important. And we need to think not just in terms of the city of Plymouth. And that's why I've deliberately not put up the boundary map, the National Marine Park, because one, it causes controversy, and two, everybody says, am I in it? And so we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about catchments, and we're going to talk about how important it is that people identify with the blue places and spaces that are near to them so that they can develop their own sense of identity around the blue. Next slide. So we have a set of work streams that work into around, which cover, I think, everything that's been talked about today. If I'm really honest, I don't understand place. I find it a really hard concept to get my own head around. I think Hannah's done a lot to help me this morning in terms of working out what place is about. And I think through the work that we'll do, we'll actually be able to deliver that, partly indirectly, but also because I've got good people like Hannah challenging me regularly. The next slide, please. Bob also asked me to talk a little bit about what I thought the strengths and opportunities were for a national marine park. And some of those strengths, there's a yin and a yang. And I haven't got a typo, but I've got a predictor, so it should say growing interest nationally, not naturally, but naturally as well. So I just wanted to pick out a couple of those. One is around gathering momentum. And it's interesting because when I started on this journey, I was actually really quite lonely. Now I wish they'd all go away. So we now have between 13 and 15 groups around the UK who want to become national marine parks. And they want to do it as a declaration. So yes, politics is important and will always be important, but you don't need the politicians to say yes. And I think one of the things we have to learn as people is that empowerment is something that's in our hands. We can make those decisions. We don't actually need somebody to tell us that there's a statute to do it. Although I'm probably very jealous of Sharon's budget, having looked at some of the graphics and marketing and promotion work she's done. Next slide, please. Some of the challenges. Explain to somebody what a national marine park is. I have lots of different elevator pitches depending on who it is. There's quite a lot of old thinking still in the world around, the best way to protect nature is to put a fence around it. Well, no, it isn't. The best way to protect nature is to show it to people, help them understand it, and then engage them in that process. I talked about the roadmap, which is still challenging. I have enough trouble getting to the loo and back. But funding is a challenge, and we're having to think about new ways of looking at funding. And Walid's presentation this morning was very relevant around that. There is opportunity through carbon funding and through biodiversity net gain, but we've got to come up with a really good, strong, sustained route for funding. Why? Because national marine parks need to be here forever, not just for the duration of a lottery project. And capacity is a bit of an issue. I'm creaking gently, but that's fine because that's part of the fun of the process. Next slide. What are the opportunities for a city such as Plymouth? For me, this is about people power, and I put it in there. I didn't put it top because I thought, well, maybe that's a bit subversive. But it is about a movement for change. And one of the things we've heard today already is that Plymouth is a city of innovation. It's innovated around fab cities. Its universities are at the cutting edge of marine science and technology. We have the naval base, and the naval base brings with it technology and innovation. And there are ways we can adapt and harness those technologies for the benefit of people and planet as well. And the blue arteries of the city, you can't go anywhere in Plymouth without seeing something blue, and we should be recognising and celebrating. No, final slide, please. And I wanted to end on a cultural note because I knew I was following Hannah, and I wanted it to be something that spoke to me. And this is one of Eliot's poems. It's a really interesting poem actually, because although you read that and you think, oh, that's really nice. So Elaine's picked a marine poem. Why wouldn't she? It's the National Marine Park. This poem is actually about the lament of an individual for not seizing the moment when it was offered to him. We need to seize the moment. The time to act has been now for the last 25 years. The time to act is now. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Elaine. That was fantastic. So I think we've got about 10 minutes for questions or so. But before I ask questions, just want to make a few observations from there. I think we saw there that key element of the bottom-up approach, but not only the bottom-up approach, but the connection to further up the chain, and that connection between policy and government and local and bottom-up approach to that. And also the move away from project. So it's interesting that Matt mentioned that you were thinking about dropping project, or you had dropped project from there. Elaine talked about more sustainable funding and the ability to think about protected landscapes or national parks in a different way. One of the key things that some of you know already is around the land-based national parks and AONBs, or national landscapes as they're called now. They're having a rethink. They're trying to reorganise themselves. They have a huge problem with funding, and some of the issues that we've seen today come from that because they go from project to project to project. So one minute they're looking at biodiversity, the next minute they're looking at cultural heritage. Then that stops and nothing happens. Actually, overall, there's been decline in nature in protected landscapes, which is quite frightening, really. So that really gives all the things we've heard today is moving away from that and developing that strong, sustainable approach, not only in terms of funding in budgets, but in terms of thinking about how we might look at these things different. Hannah talked about the strategies being built in and how you connect all these things together. So just a few observations made from those presentations. So I'll open it to questions now for the next 10 minutes or so.
I can start. It's all right. We should probably sit together so you can kind of nudge me so that if you want to speak. I mean, personally, I think the conversation needs to be an ongoing conversation between the citizen and themselves, as well as those in power and who are making decisions. And I think if you've got that basic infrastructure, you can then start to weave in these more specific conversations about, natural science or kind of built environment conversations. But we need to have the infrastructure and the ability to have a conversation in the first place, which we currently don't have. So what we see is spot conversations happening there and then there and then there. And because there's no connective tissue, those conversations never build into anything. So I think we need to start off by building the fabric of the ability to have a conversation, and then start to kind of welcome in other more specific bits to it.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I guess a couple of things to add to that. You might not be surprised to hear that I think creativity is a way of engaging. It's kind of, you may have heard me say that. So I think, that should be seen as a very powerful mechanism for engagement. I think secondly, the point that Matt was saying is those organisations, institutions really need to think about the intermediary organisations that they go through. You spoke a lot about the network. I think where those organisations and institutions struggle is where they try and make direct contact with communities with whom they have no relationship and no trust. And actually, so thinking about who are those intermediary organisations who have already done that work, they've done that relationship building, and actually can introduce new topics or thematics in a way that lands very differently to an institution doing that. I think finally, it sounds really basic, but start where people are at. That you mentioned earlier, food. If it's what someone's concern is, then start with food, and take that conversation in a different direction, or allow it to evolve. But problem I think we have is making our problem someone else's problem, and expecting them to want to do something about it. When actually, if there is a shared problem or a shared experience, there's a starting point right there. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I'll come and sit down the front and walk and talk. So I think everything that Matt and Hannah says is very, very relevant. Just to give a bit of sort of marine park insight experience around that. From the starting where people are at example. So we ran a program with young people that we're taking them swimming in the Lido. And we realised that actually most of the kids who went there when they got out weren't going to get anything to eat when they got home. So actually taking them into the Lido and making them hungry by getting them swimming and engaging with the water and doing all sorts of fun, exciting things was not necessarily a good outcome. So actually we completely changed how we were running that program to make sure that every child got something to eat for the way home, so that they could really engage in that in a meaningful way. And lots of a conversation, and Hannah's talking about projects. We've got a new project on the River Plym called the River as Citizens. And actually what we did was we went out to our local arts organisations and said, how can you help us engage with communities who relate to the River Plym in a way that is meaningful and credible? So we didn't recruit a new person, we didn't start a new organisation. We actually asked people who really know what they're talking about. And if I will say one thing about Plymouth is there are lots of brilliant people who know lots of brilliant stuff. And probably one of our biggest challenges is actually being able to talk to each other often enough and well enough to be able to take things forward as fast as we might like.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks. Any other questions? Any other questions there?
I'll start. I think. So again, I think it comes back to that. It's not an either or, and it's definitely not one thing. I think it's a whole ecosystem that needs to exist, and I'll hand to Matt in a moment because I think the work that Pop are doing is really focused on that. It's an entire network. So sometimes it's physical spaces, sometimes it's people, sometimes it's organisations, other times it's policies and processes, and it's about having an ecosystem with all of those things in play. I think the challenge really is how you financially sustain all of those things and people and organisations, because part of the issue is systemically our funding strategies are based on projects. They're not based on core funding or longevity. So we have a really, a very fundamental issue in this country about long-term sustainable thinking being funded through short-term projects. And so actually the question is, how do you sustain a whole ecosystem, which is what place development is about. Maybe you can definitely talk more.
No, I was going to say it's all of it, which is basically what you said. And I was going to say that it's the long-term vision about, well, how does Plymouth want to do its work in the future? So how would we like to be having conversations? Because these conversations happen anyway. They happen down the pub. They happen around, when people go out to cultural events and so on. They're happening. So how can we make better use of these conversations? And what would it look like if all the large players that are putting money into consultations and engagement events, what would it look like if they were starting to align that work, if not actually disinvest in their own work and start to invest in the work in the relationships that already exist? And because there's some amazing practice that exists in the city. My sense is that it's about the connection and the alignment between the activities that already exist, and the sense of longevity to those conversations as we go forward.
suppose I'm not so good on systems. I'm probably better with people, and I think the thing I would just want to mention is around the risk that we end up engaging the same people all the time. If you ask the same people the same questions, you tend to get the same answers. So I would want to look at any kind of system that engendered better communication. And by that, I mean bearing in mind that we speak a different language to people who walk down the street quite often. And I would also want people to feel confident that when they spoke, that actually we listened, rather than just ticked a box that said, oh, you're a particular demography that I'm really keen to engage with. Yeah, we've all been accosted on the street and know that we're in a particular demography for somebody, and to know that what you said actually mattered. Because if you actually want people to engage, and government is terrible at this because they mechanistically consult in a very bad way over a very short period of time to minimise the collateral damage to any kind of document that they might wish to produce, and that might seem subversive, but I've done it for a long time. Whereas I actually know what people really think, because if you really want a city to be a city and to be cohesive, you have to listen to all those voices.
I was just going to add to that. So there's a lot of stuff that's already been said. So there's a little bit about listening to what people have already been talking about. There's quite a lot of disenfranchisement when, and that's why you get the usual suspects, because they're the only ones willing to kind of step forward again, because they get something from having their voice heard.
Thank you. I think there's also a conversation with the funders, isn't there, in terms of having all these reports that you have produced of all the boxes you've ticked in, all those sort of things, and the reports and all those sort of things that often are counterintuitive to what you're trying to achieve and be successful with. So I question it about that.
Well, Paul started today with a bunch of them when he introduced the kind of rules and kind of way that the today was going to run. Sometimes it feels it's not enough about what I'm saying. But if you just shift the way that you meet, the way that you arrange your team organizing of the work, that can start to kind of really free up the individuals within that team to have their own creativity, to have their voice, to feel like they're contributing to something. And it often doesn't feel like it's enough. But the times that I would speak to someone that doesn't work in that type of environment, there's too many times that people are working in an environment where they don't feel like they can have a voice. If we can practice that, so that's at the kind of super micro individual level. But then I think there's things that we can start to think about. Transparency in the way that we work. So how do we create transparency in the work that we're doing? How do we invite in that accountability and challenge so that what we're starting to do are kind of make those really quite simple, but at times quite, that make you vulnerable. So how do we kind of do that? How do we organize our teams? What role does a manager take? That's basically how does influence and control exhibit itself in our work? And if we can start those questions, then I think what we start to kind of build are new technologies and new ways of working. But we just don't ask that question. We just assume that that's what has to happen.
For me, it's not necessarily about the intervention. It's about explaining the value of the intervention. Because we ask people to do things in their daily lives a lot, don't we? We ask them to recycle. We ask them to get on a bus, not take their car. We ask them to turn their lights off. We're not very good at saying the so what. So what if I turn my light off? So if I turn my light off, how much less carbon is that in the world? What does that mean for my children? What does that mean for my grandchildren? What does that mean for somebody who lives very close to the coast and sea level rise is looming? So we are very poor actually at explaining why it matters to do something. And if we could get a lot better at explaining why it matters, I think people would do a lot more for us, because fundamentally people are really willing animals. You know, how many times do you walk down the street and you'll see somebody who might be struggling with their shopping or won't know where they're going and they're holding their phone like me going, where the hell am I? And you'll stop and you go, can I help? Innate within people is a desire to help, but you have to enable them. You have to flick the light on for them, literally, which says, this is the why you should help. This is why it matters, should matter to you. This is why it will matter to your kids, to your street, to your community. You know, and if we did a lot more of thinking about the why, we would get a lot more help, because people are fundamentally, it's something that somebody who's very dear to me says regularly, 98% of people are really good people. So if we can get 98% of people doing really good stuff, then we're really making a movement for change.
So I just wanted to add one point to what Matt was saying, really, is I think fundamentally we have to think about power, and we have to think about distributing power better. You know, we are a predominantly white group of privileged people who have sat today and talked about all the woes in the world and how easy it is to make change. And we should really take a long, hard look at that and understand that in order for that shift to happen, in order for that kind of small steps, power, it needs to be a much more distributed network, which means people like me and you giving power away to people, communities, other voices. And I just think it's a very important shift in that kind of personal questioning of the space we take up, the decisions we make, the influence and power we have. And it really is the only way that we're going to bring other people on board, where there is more and proper representation and diversification in these conversations, and where other people have power to make change.
Yes, thank you. No, short slide. I'll just say one point, which I think ties into those as well. I think it's that term, many of you might have used the term perma-crisis or heard the term perma-crisis, where there's so many crises that people just, it's a permanent crisis and people are just stunned by, what do I do? So I don't do anything. And so that goes to Elaine's point about actually understanding what the local crises are, and then that helps the small things change, which then makes a difference in the bigger picture. Anyway, we're over time and Bob's given me the sign 3 or 4 times. So